Without any further ado, Jake, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through Git branching strategies with Power BI. So thank you for joining us.
No problem. Right. Let me share my screen. So I am going to attempt to kind of go through a little bit of what I've learned from using Git and Power BI over the last few years. So currently I work at HSBC and I'm trying to implement Power BI project deployment using Git and Azure DevOps. But previously I used to work at YouGov and I was using Power BI tools and GitLabs to do deployments over there. So I've got a couple of years playing around with this. So first of all, kind of why would you want to do this? So, I mean, there's some major problems with Power BI. So the Power BI Desktop, Power BI, PBIX. First thing is version control. There's plenty of times with Power BI Desktop where you go and the version control is there's a folder which has got 20, 50, 100 files which are version 0.1, 2, 3, 4, and you've got no idea how any of them differ from each other. That sort of workflow is very single-threaded, so only one person could be working on a version at the time, and if two people are doing two things at the same time, it's very hard to merge the results of those people's work together. In terms of oversight, someone says that they've changed 10 things, but you don't know if they've accidentally made a change that they shouldn't have done. And you've got no idea of whether or not they're following best practices. So you might. So there's plenty of problems. So in the old world, you had a couple of options. So you had Tabular Editor, which allowed you to turn your files into a BIM and deploy that way using the C# libraries, so through XMLA. And also you had PBI tools from Matthias Dierbacher, and that allowed you to deploy data sets, semantic models, but also reports as well. There is now a Microsoft endorsed way, so Power BI projects, and that effectively just takes your binary Power BI desktop file and splits it down into a defined schema of folders and files. So you can see that here. So every item is treated as the same separate thing. So Power BI desktop will treat your semantic model and report as one thing together. But in the world of PBI projects, these are completely separate. The only link that you have between your report and semantic model is in your report's definition.pbir, where you either have a hard-coded path, a folder path to the semantic model. So that's if you're working locally on your machine, or if you're in the service, then there'll be a by connection, which will be a location on the web for where that semantic model exists. Each of these are actually defined as Fabric items. So if you're talking about Git and Fabric, then these are only a subset of the things you can do. There's also the ability to version control notebooks and other stuff as well. The one thing to mention about PBIP is there's for reports and semantic models, you can have two different flavors of each at the moment. So for semantic models, you've got this this model.bin file. That's the metadata for the semantic model. So that defines all of the that defines Tom, so your tabular object model. So that's all of your tables, all of your partitions, measures, everything's there. Then you've got the new version, which is Timdal. So you'd get a file called definition, and that big JSON model.bim file is split down into individual files and folders a bit more. and that kind of helps make sure that you don't get merge conflicts. And you've got a very similar thing for report at the moment. So you've got the report.json, which is your report definition, which is one big JSON file. It's pretty unreadable. If you a lot of different pages, there will be defined by JSON, but there'll be one huge string, so it's hideous to read. As of last month, there's the PBIR format that came out. Although there are some caveats about it, but it's a lot better. So there's things like with PBIR, you can't use deployment pipelines and stuff, so it's pretty fresh, pretty new. When I was looking at the PBIP, my main question was, it's all good and everything, but then how do I get this folder and actually get this into the service and have a semantic model and reports? And if you were to look at the Power BI APIs, the only way that you can do that historically was deploying as a PBIX file. But fortunately, there are now some Fabric APIs which help. So we've got a couple of different deployment methods. First of all, got the Git integration. You just hook up you have to use Azure DevOps. You hook up your branch and your repo to a workspace, and you can just sync both ways. So everything gets auto-deployed. The actual deployment method itself is a bit of a black box. You don't care about it. You just you make changes. You see them reflected in your workspace, and you can do that all with you can use GUI, but there's also some Fabric APIs which kind of help if you want to. You can also take control of this entire deployment process with the Fabric APIs. So the main two that we care about are this create item and update item definition. And so these are REST APIs. So with these REST APIs, there's a few things we need to provide. This is what the API is expecting. So if you wanted to do an update definition, so this means there's already a Fabric item that exists in your workspace. You add a header. So you're just saying, I'm going to be passing a JSON file, and you provide your authorization token. So you use OAuth to get this, and you create a bearer token. And then in the body, you provide each of the files as parts. So you can see here, we've got this, we're updating a semantic model called test, and these are each of our files that we saw previously. So you can see definition of PBI, the data, your model.pim. The actual payload that you provide, what you have to do is convert your raw file, so your JSON file, into this base64 format, and so that compresses this down into a single line, and this is what it's expecting. A good resource for knowing how this all works is if you go to PBI Microsoft, there's a link that you can follow. So if you go down to Azure DevOps build pipelines and we scroll, there is some YAML code which is provided for us. So on the Microsoft Analysis Services GitHub, there's some build pipelines that we'll go into a second, but more useful than that is this file here, this fabric ps pbi p pism1. This provides a whole bunch of different functions, PowerShell commandlets for doing a lot of this work, which makes our life a little bit easier.
Can you make your screen a bit bigger for me?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
So we can actually see this in action quite easily. So let me here. So I have a folder with a very simple report. So let me just open that and show you. This is in PBIP format with the new PBIR format for the report.
And you're just opening it in your normal file explorer, not in
yeah, that was just normal file explorer.
Normal file explorer. So because this is all, the workspaces have to be Fabric, so you have to have Fabric capacity to use this part of it.
No.
No.
I don't think so. No, because I'm doing this at work and they're all under premium still. And the Fabric API still work for premium.
Ah.
So really simple model. It's just a table, a couple of columns. Nothing very interesting. That's all defined here. But what the interesting piece is here. So what I have done is I've come to this continuous deployment YAML, which we'll go into in a minute, and I've taken this code and stripped it back to its essential parts. So we've got this thing where we're importing the module. That module is at PMS1 so that we have access.
Sorry, Jake, can you just make it a little bit bigger for us? Perfect, thank you.
So we can import this module so we have access to those commandlets. We're authenticating so that we can get our bearer token. And then we're going to do our deployment. So I've taken that, put it down to its bare essentials. So all we need is to import, get a Fabric auth token, and then say, I want to import these two Fabric items. So what we will need to do is, first thing you need is your tenant ID for Azure. That's quite easy to get. You can get that from Entra ID. And then for your workspace, I'm going to create one. You can grab the ID from up here. And then it's just a case of running this. So it's going to want to get me to sign on with two-factor authentication. If you're using a service principal, you don't need to do that. Okay, there we go. And you can see down here that it is. I can expand it. It's grabbing all these parts, turning them into the right format, and running the API to deploy them. To refresh this, see that we've pushed all this to our workspace. One thing you will notice is you won't have any data. If you want any data, you have to go refresh. This will only take a second. There we go.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So let's go back to the presentation. So we've got a data format with a way of deploying, but now we have to think about, there's some things that we need to start to think about to figure out how we want to set up a deployment and a branching strategy. So the first thing to mention would be, you could do all of this Git by yourself locally on a machine and never push it to a remote repo. But you do get some benefits of having a remote repo. And first piece would be pipelines. So in the same way that we just ran that PowerShell script to do the deployment, the pipelines will effectively run a container, so a VM, a virtual machine that will do that, run that script for you, and it's going to run that based on triggers, of which there's a few different types. So you can either manually run a pipeline, or you can set a branch, merge request or scheduled, and you can define that for different branch names. So for example, if you have a feature branch and you create a merge request to pull that into your main branch, then you can set up a trigger that will run that job after the merge has succeeded, for example. So you can be very granular in how you want this stuff to work. And then if you were deploying into production, for example, you might want to add a schedule so that the deployment only ever occurs overnight when no one's going to be using the report or the semantic model, so you don't get any disruption. And you can really kind of come up with a good strategy for how you want everything to work together. There is a feature that's really good called pre-merge, which is very beneficial, which I'll talk about later. But it effectively allows you to do the deployment on the resultant merging of your source and target branches without actually doing performing the merge. So you can do this prior to the merge happening, and it's a good way of testing to see whether or not everything that you've got is valid. So you might have manually changed something in your definition, which may not result in a valid API request, so the pipeline is going to fail. So you might want to do a pre-merge so that you don't have to do multiple merge requests to keep triggering the same pipeline over and over again. Again, a horrific Git history. So when you're coming up with this strategy, one thing you're going to have to think about is how do you want your Power BI environment to look like? I quite like this setup where you have a single workspace which houses all of your semantic models. And the main advantage of that is you don't really have to. It's easier to provide. Well, the segregation of your data sets and reports means that when you're given permissions to view different items, so if you're talking about a reports workspace, that's going to be very audience dependent, and there's going to be different end users, whereas the semantic models are primarily going to be accessed by developers. So this is quite a nice way to segment who has permissions to different things. And then you might have some composite models which are doing different things. The way that you might add Git to this is I would say you'd probably want a single repo per semantic model, so you get a really clean Git history. But also you have to think about permissions within your repo as well. So if you've got very complicated data sets and you have different specialists in your team who are experienced with different semantic models, then you might say that the merge approver for a specific semantic model is going to be person A for repo 1, person B for repo 2. I think this biggest problem with the Git integration in the fact that with Git integration, your workspace has to mirror your data set. So you can't have multiple repos all feeding into one workspace. But with Fabric APIs, you have the flexibility to do whatever you want. And in terms of the report, you can have multiple reports per workspace, and these are going to be very audience based because these are going to result in an app which is going to be consumed by a subset of end users. there's a whole bunch of pre-existing branching strategies that exist out in the wild, and one thing to mention is all these are perfectly valid, and you could probably use any of these, and the choices that you're going to make about which one you want to use is going to be up to you and your team and how you want to work and how you want everything to work together. So you can go from the very basic trunk based, where you just have one single branch. It's GitHub flow, where you have your trunk with feature branching. Microsoft DevOps likes this release flow. It's slightly different. So these two use merges, but these cherry pick topics to create different releases. So you might have release version 1, release version 2 as these separate branches, which kind of die. They only exist for that version of the release. And then you've also got Git flow. And from my work at HSBC, I am personally kind of married to the idea of Git flow being quite a nice option, particularly because we want to have those triggers be able to deploy into those 3 environments, so dev, UAT, and production. And all the strategies that you can pick kind of range from kind of probably fairly simple. So if we were to think about GitHub flow, then you'd have your main branch, your main trunk, and you would, if you were to come in and decide you want to work on a feature, so a new, maybe you want to add a new table, add a new measure, then you would create a branch. Well, so if this is all into Azure DevOps, you would, if you're also using Azure DevOps issues, then you would create a work item. You might create a feature branch which is named after that item. So something like feature.jd.12345. You would go to your local environment. You would have Azure DevOps set up as your origin for your file, your folder. You would do a git pull or a fetch to kind of get everything to refresh, and you can then connect to branch that you've made in the remote repository. You can do all your work there locally. You can do you'd be able to open up your file just as you would any other, just like Power BI desktop. You do all your work. You would make atomic commits as you work, so you kind of saving your work as you go. And the one thing to say about try and be kind to yourself in the future. So don't do a huge amount of work and then do a commit, and then do a huge amount of work and then do a commit. Do very isolated atomic units of work per commit, so that if you ever need to, if anything ever breaks, you can track down exactly where something broke and kind of revert that single commit, as opposed to wading through a huge commit. So you can do all that work. You can make multiple commits. When you're ready, you would do a push back to the remote repository. In the remote repository, you create a merge request, and that would you would then ideally have your trigger kick off to do a deployment, or in this case, it might be that we're utilizing Git integration. So if we merge into main, if we have our main branch linked up to our development workspace, then all we'd have to do is go into, once the merge request has been approved and enacted, we'd go into Power BI service, go to the Git window, and just tell it to sync, and it will pull all the changes to the workspace, make those changes in our dev environment, and then you could just use deployment pipelines for the rest of it. So this would be a case where you would be able to unlock the ability to keep track of what's being changed. You can work simultaneously with other developers and make changes, but still generally then follow the classic workflow that many people use. The version I quite like is using Git flow. So we've got a lot more branches here. So the way that this would work is you've got your main branch, which would reflect what's in production. Your dev branch will reflect what's in dev, and your release branch will reflect what's in test UAT. So in the same way, the only slight difference from before is if a developer was going to do work, they would create a new branch of dev, and they would do their work here. The one nice thing that I would say for triggers in regards to feature to dev is if you do a remerge build. So with using GitLabs, you can define that in your YAML. So the YAML is the pipeline definition, and that's where you define those triggers. In Azure DevOps, you have to do that with a build policy, so it's a bit more faffy. It'd be nice if it's just YAML, then you wouldn't have to use the GUI to enact that policy. But the advantage of that is, say I made a change. So at the moment, I was adding a feature to our deployment process where I have a JSON file in our repo, and depending on which environment we're deploying into, you can overload Power BI parameters. So for example, if you're deploying into dev, then maybe you're connecting to a development database, but if you're in production, that you'd be connecting to a production database or data warehouse or lake, whatever it is. And I kept having I be able to debug all of that. Initially, I was doing that all in PowerShell on my local machine. It was working fine, but I'm using Linux containers to actually do the deployment online. So there's some slight caveats. So Microsoft like to use backslashes, whereas Mac and Linux use forward slashes for their folders and stuff. So as I was debugging the difference between Windows and Linux, I had to create a few different commits to kind of test this pipeline to make sure it was working. With the remerge builds, I just had this one pull request created, merge request. I could keep committing to this branch, and it would keep running the pipeline, just adding new commits on, without having to create multiple merge requests and muddying up the waters. And when everything worked, you can just you can do the merge with a squash. So effectively, what you do is you take however many commits you've got and squash it all down to one single commit. So I could just have something. So although I might have had 20 commits in my feature branch, I can just make it look like there was one, and it kind of decouples. And I think that has its greatest value in this feature to dev, because this is the only place where you're adding new stuff. If you're going from dev to release or release to main, you're really only just promoting something that's already been tested. So you do your feature to dev. So what So what you would expect to happen is maybe you're performing a sprint of work, and you've got multiple issues that are being addressed by developers. When you get to the end of that sprint, you get to a point where you have a commit in dev, and you think, okay, I think this version here is the version we're going to try and push out to production. This is going to be our next release version. When that happens, you can just create a merge request into the release branch, and this is our release candidate, and that gets pushed to UAT. In UAT, we can then actually do our proper validations, so we can get end users to look at the semantic model reports, give their approval, their sign off. If there's any bugs, you would address those in the release branch, and once those have all been resolved, you would do a merge into main, and at the same time you do a merge back into dev, so you'd be able to reconstitute any bug fixes or anything back up into dev. So the other things that you might want to start to look at with deployments is at the moment that it's only performing the deployment of the fabric items. There's also, you might also want to have that parameter thing I was talking about, where you overlay parameters depending on which environment. You might want to set it up so that you are binding the data set to gateways, so that you're connecting up. The one caveat I would say is the Power BI APIs, when you're trying to connect gateway connections to semantic models, or even just updating, patching connections, is they are supported for the enterprise gateway, but VNet is not supported, which is kind of frustrating. The other thing you might want to do is you might want to enact a dataset refresh, and if you're using this API, you can decide whether or not you want that to be a full refresh, or you can do an enhanced one, and you can hit individual partitions, and you can pick if you need your how detailed you want that refresh to be. So it could be, you can do automatic, full, it might be metadata only. It depends entirely on what you're trying to do. If it's in, if you're deploying into development or UAT, then you might only want to do an automatic. So that's just going to rehydrate any data that it needs to. So if you've just added a calculated column, if you use automatic, it's just going to calculate that calculated column, but it won't completely refresh all the data. If you do a full refresh, then it will refresh everything.
We've got a question for you, Jake. How do we get the report name of the last commit / pull request to main?
The what, sorry?
So that's from Santiago. How do we get the report name of the last commit or the pull request to the main? Don't know if you want to come off, Santiago, and ask off mute.
Yeah, I don't quite understand the question.
No,
because the report name and everything is going to be defined in your definition. For example, this test.report. I think, yeah, here we go. The actual name is all going to be defined.
You showed how to get the workspace, and
I'm trying to remember. So here we go. For this dot platform, you can see that the semantic model has a display name of test. So that's what it's using to do its deployment. So if I change this to test 1, and then we ran the script again, you know what? It'll create a new. Okay, so it's going to create a new data set, but it's not going to create a corresponding.
I'm finding this fascinating, Jake, because I don't work with enterprise data. Most of my businesses are sort of 500 plus.
I've got test one.
Ah.
So yeah, so the definition of how all this for everything is pretty much all defined within your the PBIP format.
Yeah, which you're accessing through Visual Studio Code.
Yeah, then, Visual Studio. Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go. I've started exploring Visual Studio Code.
Yeah, I was just going to mention you can. It is quite nice place to actually do a lot of this stuff because you have access to a lot of pieces. The one piece that's quite nice is Git graph.
Yeah. Henrique, who's my study buddy. So I have a study buddy that I meet up with once a week, a couple of them, but Henrique is my back end guy, which he will be laughing at being called that, but he's the one that's taken on board learning, and he's very pleased with Git graph. It just said it makes it so easy to see what's the branches that are coming through.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is be a bit careful because Git's got plenty of options, but there's things you can do like cherry picking or rebasing, which effectively means that you're changing history. Because Git itself is very similar to, in some ways, to say Delta Lake and the other new table formats, and the fact that you have a transaction log which says what changes are happening in files.
Yeah.
And if you start to change history, you can run into
mess
trouble.
it up. Yeah.
But the main problem is if you try to push those changes to a remote repo, because if it detects that you've started to change history, then you have to do a force push. And if you've done a force push, then other developers that are also working off that history, their merges become invalid, and trying to merge everything together and dealing with the conflicts can be a bit of a pain.
Yeah.
Which is why merge requests are nice, but cherry picking and rebasing can make things look very clean, but can also be a little bit of a headache if you're just getting into it, merge requests, and then you can change your philosophy later. I mean, the great thing about any of these strategies is you can easily swap between them at will in the same repo. So you can start off with something really simple, and then going into something more complicated would just be the case of updating your pipeline to expect those new branches.
Yeah. Quick question from Pavel. He needs to note that in case of corporate Power BI ecosystem, you may not get access to use the API calls, and similar topic with the Git integration and the licensing policy to get access to the underlying Azure.
Yeah, so you're gonna have to get access to a service principal. Service principal itself, with the Fabric APIs, they technically don't support service principals currently, but only in the sense that you need to add that service principal to the workspace. So you get your service principal, you add it to the workspace with, I mean, I've been adding it with admin privileges, but I think you could probably get away with contributor, and then it can do the deployment successfully. It's not like the admin level Power BI APIs where the service principal doesn't need any permissions specifically to the workspaces. It can just enact it as being an admin.
And the other comment was that if you use local machine Git integration tool, that can store snapshots of your data set on your local drive, which then means that sensitive data could be outside of the confined data areas. And if you use Visual Studio to tinker with the Power BI dataset, it saves even data on your local hard drive.
I mean, the only data that gets saved is if you're talking about this cache.abf. So this is a backup file for the analysis services tabular database. This is where the data is. There's also a copy of the model.bim in here as well. So technically you could get this and reconstitute the semantic model. If you could work on this entirely with this not thing that would exist here is metadata. There wouldn't be any data. It's only when you open it up and click refresh that it's going to create that that cache file. So it comes down to what data you're going to download onto your system. If you're just using this to tinker with the report, because it could be that if you're only working on reports and you're using thin reports, so there's a data model that exists in the service, and your definition.powerbi, so this thing is by connection to that online version. You'd never have any data locally. It would just be passed through to the Power BI service and getting data from there. So there's plenty of development you can do where you never pull data down.
Brilliant, thank you. It's just the comments coming through in the chat. It's always good to have the communication. Lots of positives and wanting the recordings to watch as well later, and comments about your flow models being particularly well done and very useful. And a request for the PowerPoint.
If you want to make these were actually made in Markdown. So there's a library called Mermaid with Markdown, which you can do all these with. So these are really simple to do. All you effectively say checkout branch, commit, create branch, merge request, and it just does it all for you.
Oh wow! I wouldn't have thought. It's brilliant, isn't it? I wouldn't have thought Markdown would do that, but
I think I actually have it somewhere. Yeah,
because I always think of Markdown as just text rather than to be able to achieve, the visuals.
Because this is Markdown as well. Because you can define code, so you can do syntax highlighting of DAX and everything. So in your documentation, so for example, in my Git repo for a Power BI model, your README is in Markdown, so you could have mermaid diagrams and stuff describing all your documentation for how things work.
Yeah. The comments that came through about Git are from a jealous developer that wishes he was able to use Git in his business, but he's not allowed.
Yeah, I'm not going to find the mermaid thing. But mermaid's great. You can do flow diagrams and everything, Gantt charts, loads.
I'm sure someone will find it and put a link in the chat for us. That's fast. I didn't realise that was Mermaid, Markdown.
Here we go. So you type it out like this. So you go git graph, commit, branch develop, and it does all this for you.
Brilliant. Enrique, I want to see that on Friday.
Very simple. It's definitely supported with Azure DevOps if you're using it. The only thing you have to do is add some bits before and after. Tell it that it should use Mermaid, but that's about it.
Right. That makes it so clear to see, doesn't it?
And Mermaid's quite nice in the fact that Markdown's quite nice with Git as well, because if I had, so for example, in my in my folder here, I'd have a README. That would be my Markdown. But then I've also got a folder called Assets, and if there's any images that you want to peer into that in there, you can save those in your Assets folder, and you just provide a by path connection, and you can get all your images. So if you, and those could be GIFs or something as well. So if you want to show people how things work, then they'll come
and
through.
it's free. Henry's asked. I'm sure it's free because it's Markdown.
Yeah. It's just there by default. It's in loads of different things. For example, GitHub provides free GitHub pages, and they support Markdown and everything. It seems to be fairly standard. Fairly ubiquitous.
Brilliant. Yes, free. And a question from Jude: where did you learn all this, apart from the MS document PS script repos? And also, do you have a Medium/GitHub page?
So a good place to look is if you go to Fabric APIs. There's all the documentation for the Fabric REST APIs, and we have item definitions for the semantic models and the reports. And there's a huge amount here. So it will tell you not everything in BBIP is needed. So it'll tell you what files are absolutely needed. It'll tell you what definition it's kind of expecting. Give you a list of all the APIs. So I think these are down as core. Yeah. So admin. Core. Create item, update item definition. It'll tell you how all this works.
So did you? Did you know all of this when you started working with Matthias, or is this? How did you sort of go into the back end development? What was your career path in a way, Jake?
So my career path was I started out doing a degree in biochemistry and worked for clinical trials. I went into operations roles, did reporting in Excel. A lot of our data I found out was actually was on Hadoop, so I learned how to query all that with Query Hive and do Power BI development there. Then I focused on DAX and data modeling. I did the mastering tabular from the SQL BI guys, which gives you a huge background to all of the Tom stuff. And then I got to go work with Matthias and saw how he was doing Git stuff. A lot of that work and all the client libraries all depends on the Microsoft C# libraries. There's a whole bunch of them. The most important ones for kind of interacting with the XMLA endpoint are the analysis service.tabular. And then there's the AMO, which I think you use for doing queries against your semantic models. So yeah, I spent a year using PBI tools, and you get a good feel for how Tom's structured from the fact that you see it every day as a merge request. So you get a feel of how the different hierarchies all look. But all of this stuff is brand new. So Matthias only came up with Timdal just as both me and him were ending at YouGov. And then it's only become Power BI project since I've been in HSBC. The only way that when I first started to look at trying to use PBIP as a deployment method, because I didn't want to use PBI tools, because then I would have to kind of go through the whole corporate process of allowing for an open source project to be hosted internally. And I wanted to do everything the Microsoft way possible. But the first thing I really did was when Rui started doing his initial webinars, I went into this fabric thing, fabric PowerShell module. I went through and refactored all of these pieces and figured out exactly how everything worked and what he was doing. And only when I started doing this did I realize that there were these new Fabric APIs that existed, because I don't think they were very well.
So I'd be very. What does refactor mean? Does that mean just rebuild it to understand how it works?
Yeah. So if you start to read a lot of what's here, some of these functions are very big and they do a lot of things.
Yeah.
So the way that I started to understand it was I would take a bunch of code which is related, I would turn that into a function and give it, and then put it into a submodule.
Okay.
So it might be
breaking it down.
Yeah, and then your function that you're reading here is just a series of steps. So it might be step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but each of those 5 steps might be 200 lines of code, but you've kind of conceptualized it down to just 5 lines. And so it's much more manageable, trying to understand what it's doing and how it's working.
Yeah, it's key concepts, isn't it? Break it down, simplify it so that you can understand each bit and then piece it back together again.
Yeah. None of this is too bad. It's actually gone a lot easier, because up to a month or 2 ago, Timdal wasn't supported. So if you wanted to use Git with Timdal, you then had to convert your Timdal into BIM to do the deployments. And the way that you do that is by default.
Yeah. So I was just going to explain to people, Timdal is tabular model definition language, and it's a way that you can actually read the metadata surrounding the Power BI report, and it's written in such a way that it makes it very easy to read.
It's very YAML-like, so it looks like this, whereas .bim is one big JSON blob.
Yeah.
There is a function that allows you to swap between those, and by default, this script is going to download some DDLs, so these Microsoft Analysis Services. These are the C# libraries. And part of this DLL, there's a Timdal serializer, which allows you to convert between the two. And it's quite nice, quite easy to enact the changes, but it does mean that you need these things to exist.
Yeah.
But you don't have to worry about that anymore. Timdal, PBAR, and everything is all supported natively. You don't have to jump through any hoops.
And it's what makes it useful is when you're comparing different reports and different models together, it enables you to see the difference quite easily. So it makes it easier for a human being to see it. Quick question from Henrik. I missed syntax colouring of M inside a Timdal file. Do you know if that's on the roadmap?
I think it is. I think they were planning to do that with the because in VS Code you've got this. It defines what type of file you've got, and you get your syntax, your color coding. So if you go here, you can see this is tabular model definition language, and you can get that by installing the extension. So if you looked at Timdal, so here we go, Timdal support from Microsoft. So syntax highlighting that says more coming soon. So it depends what Microsoft provide, what you'll be able to see.
And the other question, Jude said, do you have a Medium or a GitHub page or anything that you?
I do have a blog.
Oh.
Just got some stuff on.
I think I'm still about 33% of the way through the tabular model from the SQL BI people. I've started it and I'm still about, that's a to-do by the end of the year. but it's just such a
Definitely worth
massive.
going through.
Yeah, it's a massive course, isn't it? The content is fabulous, but
it's the kind of thing where it's good to skim through it and at least get it lodged in your brain, and then
yeah.
once you actually come to it, you'll know where to go back to kind of find the information.
I keep meaning to go back to the advanced data modeling one, because you sort of think, oh, I know more than when I did it now, so I want to go back and unravel some of the core principles or bits that I've missed.
One piece that I always forget is the optimizing DAX. So
Yeah.
it goes all the way down to looking at the logs for the logical and physical query plans.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I always forget how to read those.
Yeah.
Forget.
And yeah, Sean was saying, and stop when it's good enough. It's just, yeah. Any last questions for Jake? Great stuff, well done. And to have targets. Oh, Jude, I have got a list of targets that I want to achieve. So I always have targets. I have lists.
Yeah.
What about you, Jake? What's your targets for this year? Do you want to achieve?
My last big one was trying to get this site working, because what I really wanted to do was get
pop it in.
Highlight.
Yep.
Try and
This
get
your blog
syntax highlight
site.
to work. Yeah.
Yeah. If you can pop it in the chat.
If I can.
Should be able to.
Can I see chat? I was thinking about it. Yeah, I was trying to get syntax highlighting working. And the way so this is using GitHub Pages.
Yeah.
So all
you
of this.
Jekyll.
Yeah, so it uses Jekyll, which runs off Ruby.
Yeah.
And their syntax highlighter by default is called Rouge. So I created a DAX lexer in Rouge to do all the syntax highlighting. So I had some fun playing with Ruby and also Docker. So I was meaning to use Docker for a while, because all the testing you use Docker to create a test environment to test all this stuff's working. But annoyingly, I got so far and submitted it to the Rouge guys, and I'm still waiting for them to approve it. So in the meantime, there's another library, highlight.js, which Microsoft and SQL BI use, and you can self-host that. So I created another lexer, which I'm using here.
Okay. Brilliant.
So the stuff I need to add to here, but I just need to find time in between kids and.
Yeah, Jake's got a 2 and a 4-year-old and a very, very a good job and career. So it is that juggling all the time. I think it's that work-life balance. But if you find it interesting, then it becomes more doable, doesn't it?
Yeah. One of the good things about learning Docker is it gets you into the mindset of how pipelines work, because effectively you're just running a Docker container in the cloud. So a lot of your dependencies might be, so if you had a bunch of DLLs or libraries that you needed to be installed for your pipeline, you can just create a Docker container, host those on Azure, and that would be your build agent for your pipeline. So you wouldn't have to do a whole bunch of installation as part of your pipeline.
And then can you change that Docker to each part of the pipeline? So, or is that, or does it encompass the whole pipeline?
It'd be the whole pipeline. For example, if you were to look at, so if you're using PBI tools, Matthias provides Docker images, and so his pipelines are super simple, because here you go. So Docker pull or PBI tools core. So he's already pre-installed everything here. So you just run that, and then your pipeline is just a case of doing a PBI tools deploy this thing, and so it's a one-liner. You don't have to worry about. You just get really simple.
Yeah. So it's almost like a virtual environment. A bit I use Anacoda, so sometimes you build the virtual environments with the specific types of code that you want, or the versions. So it's the similar type of thing to that.
And it's very powerful as well, because you don't, for example, Ruby only runs on Linux. So if you're running, if you run Docker, you can run a Linux image, and then you can test it that way. And also, you don't have to download a whole load of bloat to your computer.
Yeah.
You can just have a built image that you can just use, and then whoever's using that image is always going to get the same result as you are.
Yeah.
It might be that you've configured something a certain way on your local machine, or
and which understandably, I understand. We're at just after 7, Jake. That was fascinating. I think it's one of the quietest the chats have been, but I think that's because we're all just taking it in, and just a different mindset for me from seeing the way that you have to work as a developer in a large corporate organization. It's completely different, and but fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Well, none of this is being used currently. It's still in development. Because it's also new. So
it's also new. It's also new. Yeah. But you're ahead of the curve. So that's brilliant. So a huge thank you, Jake, for coming and taking the time out to share your knowledge with us. And I will, if you put your
like the chat's not loading for me, it's just spinning. So.
All right, if you wouldn't mind just popping your, because I didn't capture your email, your site, I can pop that into
evaluation context.github.io. If it's on, I think it's linked on my LinkedIn as well.
Right, I'll find it and pop it in. And
so LinkedIn, where it says there you go, view my blog thing.
Right, okay, I'll find that and pop it in, and then I'll record this. Oh, thank you, Curtis. Someone's popped it in for me, and I will record this and pop it onto YouTube this evening so that everyone can access it. But Jake, thank you. I know how busy life is, and to take the time out to prepare something like this for us takes hours, so it is hugely appreciated by me, and I've learnt so much this evening, and it's encouraged me even more, Henrique, to focus on looking at Git and Visual Studio Code, because I think it is, so incredibly useful for the version control and understanding the model and how it's developing and changing. So thank you, Jake, much appreciated. And next week we're not here because I'm on holiday. But the week after, it's all about P6 and Primavera and how to utilize that, which is going to be brilliant because it's a project management tool. And yes, definitely most in-depth and useful Git integration material I've seen anywhere from Harry. So yeah, I agree, Harry. It's just blown my mind, actually sat there listening. So I will make sure that this goes onto YouTube so that we can all rewatch it and delve into it, and follow Jake and his blog and journeys. So thank you, and take care, Jake, and very much appreciated. Bye all. I'll stop recording and then come off. Stop recording. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.